You can also write asynchronous code for functions that yield promises, and it's actually easier than for functions that yield callbacks. So here I'll add another test where I basically, again, want to check whether a token value was generated. And I will add my function here, but now without the done parameter. And in this function, I have my test user email address. And then I want to call generate token promise like this. And to this function, I want to pass my test user email address because that is the parameter value this function expects. But now this function returns a promise, and just as before, we can't just get our value like this. Now, what can we do though? There are a couple of ways of making such a promise-based test work. For example, expect supports promises out of the box. You can wrap your function call where you get back a promise into expect, so you can expect the promise which you get back from this function call to be something. And now instead of to be or anything like this, you can chain two other keywords, rejects and resolves. Which basically means you expect the resolved value of the promise returned by this function call to be something. So now you can again chain your to be methods, any to be methods. But now this will refer to the value the promise you got back here actually resolved to. And if you're writing a test where you expect the promise to reject and you want to evaluate the error you got after the rejection, for example, in such cases you could use rejects and then combine that with the to methods. But here I expect the promise to resolve, so I add resolves, and then to be, and then whatever you expect it to be. In this case, I actually expect it to be defined. The value that I get back from the promise eventually should be defined. It should not be undefined. It should be defined because eventually I expect to get back the token. And you could, of course, alternatively test for an exact value or test for the value to be of type string, but I will just write this test. And with this, if I save this, all my tests run again, and this test passes as well. And just to verify that it really was evaluated and that we didn't just skip something again, you can also check for something that doesn't make sense. For example, the resolved value to be 2, and if you save this, it fails. And that's what I meant. Testing for promises is much easier than with those callback functions. Here I will go back to the correct test though. But this was also just one way of testing this. You could also test for promises differently. I'll just copy the promise test from up there and show you the alternative approach, though this approach is of course great. It's concise, it works, it's perfect. But you could also use async await. You can actually add the async keyword in front of your testing function, and then you can of course get your token in there by awaiting the result of calling generate token promise with the test user email. And thereafter, since the next line after await will only execute once this line finished, you can use expect as you did before, and you can expect the token to be defined, for example. If you now run your tests again, they still work, and if we quickly check for something that doesn't make sense, it fails as expected. But I will again go back to be defined. So that's an alternative way of testing your promises. You can use async await, and it is up to you what you prefer. Async await might especially make a lot of sense if you actually have multiple steps you want to execute instead of just one single function call, but ultimately you can go with whichever approach you prefer.